Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. We're going to take a look at the message that Pope Leo XIV just gave to all of the Eastern churches, the various representatives that are currently already in Rome for participants and representatives already in Rome for the Jubilee of the Eastern churches. He just had an audience with them. The Holy See just posted the transcript of it. And so we're going to take a look and see what the Pope has said to them. This will, of course, be of interest to really, I think, everybody, not just Latin Rite Catholics, but especially Eastern Rite Catholics. So the Eastern Catholic churches in communion with Rome. This will also be of interest to Eastern Orthodox because it kind of shows how Pope Leo views the Eastern Catholic churches that are in communion with Rome. And that has some bearing on negotiations and relations with Eastern Orthodox. Often, the Eastern Orthodox look and see, how is Rome dealing with the Eastern churches? At various points in church history, Rome has kind of held this Latin Rite supremacy view and has said that the Latin Rite is better and superior than the Eastern rites, and kind of taken that triumphalist view. Some of the popes started to back away from that. Pope Leo XIII, for example, started to back away from that. And especially at Vatican II, you start to have more of an emphasis on how all of the rites of the church are equal in dignity and honor. As we're going to see, Pope Leo XIV is going to re-express that all of the rites have equal dignity and honor. Kind of, again, the popes and the Vatican Council kind of walking back that Latin Rite supremacy that we saw from the popes. This is going to have bearing on relations with the Eastern Orthodox, because they look and see, how is Rome treating the Eastern churches? In some cases, Rome has told the Eastern churches, even at Vatican II, preserve your traditions. But then there were constantly obstacles that Rome was putting in the way for them to do that, some of which Pope Francis removed. Perfect example of that is the discipline or the allowance of married clergy in the priesthood in these Eastern churches. If you look at that situation, it was certainly the case that Vatican II told them, preserve your traditions, preserve those things. But then Rome was telling some of the Eastern churches in the United States, you can't have married clergy. And Pope Francis finally lifted that because he recognized the inconsistency in what Rome was saying on the one hand and doing on the other. So, the Eastern Orthodox look to those things because they want to know, okay, if we ever have reunion with Rome, how's Rome going to treat us? Well, we know how Rome would treat us if we were reconciled by looking to see, how does Rome treat the Eastern Catholic churches? Okay, so I say all that to tell you this is why stuff like this is important, because it has a lot of implications. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let me share my screen and we're going to take a look at it. Please let me remind y'all, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and the like button. Really would appreciate your support. And great to see everyone there in the live chat. Okay, so here is what the Vatican just posted. Address of the Holy Father, audience with participants in the Jubilee of the Eastern Churches. So this morning in the Paul VI Hall, the Holy Father Leo XIV received in audience the participants at the Jubilee of the Eastern Churches. The following is the address delivered by the Pope to the participants in the audience. So he says, your beatitudes, your eminence, your excellencies, dear priests, consecrated men, women, brothers and sisters. He says, Christ is risen. He is truly risen. I greet you in these words that Eastern Christians in many lands never tire of repeating during the Easter season. Let me maybe zoom in on that so y'all can see it a little bit better. Okay. So that should be a little bit more readable for y'all. It is moving, or very moving, for me to see you here during the Jubilee of Hope, a hope unshakably grounded in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Welcome to Rome. I'm happy to be with you and devote one of the first audiences of my pontificate to the Eastern faithful. You are precious in God's eyes. Looking at you, I think of the diversity of your origins, your glorious history, and the bitter sufferings that many of your communities have endured or continue to endure. And some of these churches came back into communion with the Council of Florence. Some of them came back a little bit later based on the negotiations at Florence. Others came into communion several centuries later. Each of them have their own traditions and histories on their reconciliation with the Catholic Church. Some of them came from Eastern Orthodox churches. Some of them came from Oriental Orthodox churches. Some of them came from the Assyrian Church of the East, right? So he says, I would like to reaffirm the conviction of Pope Francis. Once again, we're seeing him building on Pope Francis, reaffirming Pope Francis. He does that in pretty much every one of his audiences. I want to reaffirm the conviction of Pope Francis that the Eastern churches are to be cherished and esteemed for the unique spiritual and sapiential traditions that they preserve, and for all that they have to say to us about the Christian life, synodality, and the liturgy. Yes, the Eastern churches are huge into synodality. Some might point out that there is a difference between the synodality that they have versus the synodality of Rome with the Synod on Synodality. With the Synod on Synodality, it doesn't really have any kind of authority. With synodality in the Eastern churches, those synods actually have authority. They have a teaching authority, they have a governing authority to one degree or another. We think of the early fathers, the councils, and monasticism, inestimable treasures for the church. And so here he is quoting or referencing Pope Francis. I would also like to mention Pope Leo XIII, the first pope to devote a specific document to the dignity of your churches, which is true, which was needed because prior to Leo XIII, some popes held to this Latin Rite supremacy view that the Latin Rite was better than all the Eastern Rite churches. It was better, it had more dignity, it had more honor. It was this Latin Rite supremacy view. Rome kind of ended up abandoning that, at least for the time being, under Leo XIII especially. And again, Vatican II restated all of the liturgies, all of the rites, Eastern, West, they're all of equal dignity. So Rome kind of walked back some of those previous claims about the Eastern churches, and that helped build good relations with not only the Eastern Catholic churches, but also the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and so on. Inspired above all by the fact that, in his words, the work of human redemption began in the East. Truly, you have a unique and privileged role as the original setting where the church was born. And here he's referencing John Paul II. It is significant that several of your liturgies, which you are now solemnly celebrating in Rome in accordance with your various traditions, continue to use the language of the Lord Jesus. Indeed, Leo XIII made a heartfelt appeal that the legitimate variety of Eastern liturgy and discipline may redound to the great honor and benefit of the church. His desire remains ever timely. In our own day, too, many of our Eastern brothers and sisters, including some of you, have been forced to flee their homelands because of war and persecution, instability and poverty, and risk losing not only their native lands, but also when they reach the West, their religious identity. As a result, with the passing of the generations, the priceless heritage of the Eastern churches is being lost. And in addition to that, Rome has kind of served as an obstacle itself for the East preserving their traditions in communion with Rome. On the one hand, telling them, preserve your traditions. On the other hand, putting obstacles on the Eastern Catholic churches to do just that. And a lot of the Eastern Catholic churches are very frustrated with Rome doing that, kind of saying one thing, doing another. And so maybe we're going to continue to see that change. We saw that with Pope Francis starting to be more consistent. Hopefully we'll see that also with Leo XIV. I think that would be a great thing for the Eastern Catholic churches that are right now very heavily Latinized in some ways for various reasons. Over a century ago, Leo XIII pointed out that the preserving of the Eastern rites is more important than is generally realized. He went so far as to decree that any Latin Rite missionary, whether a member of the secular or regular clergy, who by advice or support draws any Eastern Rite Catholic to the Latin Rite, ought to be dismissed and removed from his office. That was a big thing. There was a huge war between Latin Rite Catholics and Eastern Rite Catholics, and some Latin Rite Catholics were sheep stealing, and they were just dogging out the Eastern Rite Catholic priests, saying that they're not real priests. We saw that here in the United States with very prominent bishop who caused a lot of problems for the Eastern Catholic churches in the United States, and just snubbed them and just treated their priest as, you're not even a priest, because because you had been married at one point. Your spouse is now dead, but at one point you were married and you got a wedding ring on. So we're going to look down on you and treat you like garbage. I mean, there was a lot of really bad blood here, some really negative things that happened. And, hopefully that there's going to continue to be a shift here, a walking back of those things, and more respect for the Eastern Rite churches. We willingly reiterate this appeal to preserve and promote the Christian East, especially in the diaspora. In addition to establishing Eastern circumscriptions wherever possible and opportune, there is a need to promote greater awareness among Latin Christians. Absolutely. Vast majority of Latin Rite Christians don't even know the Eastern Catholic churches exist. They've never heard of them. They're in full communion with them, but they have no idea who they are. Never even heard of it. You talk to the average Latin Rite Catholic and mention an Eastern Catholic, they have no idea what you're talking about. If anything, they think that you're talking about the Eastern Orthodox. I saw a Latin Rite Catholic, somebody said something positive about the Eastern Catholic churches. A Latin Rite Catholic came back and said, "What are you talking about? These are schismatic heretics that were condemned and anathematized in 1054. There's just a lack of awareness in catechesis here, right? Catholic Church is made up of actually 24 different churches, 23 of which are Eastern Catholic churches, but the vast majority don't even know this. So he's saying, you know what? Latin Rite Catholics need to become more aware, right? There needs to be a greater awareness of these Eastern churches that they're in communion with. In this regard, I asked the dicastery to the Eastern churches, which I thank for its work, to help me to define principles, norms, and guidelines whereby Latin bishops can concretely support Eastern Catholics in the diaspora in their efforts to preserve their living traditions and thus by their distinctive witness to enrich the communities in which they live, which is helpful because, again, sometimes Latin Rite bishops have not always been very supportive of the Eastern churches in their area, in their territory. They kind of sometimes see it as a threat. Like if you're the bishop of a particular territory, a Latin Rite bishop, but you got an Eastern Catholic parish in that same territory, well, that parish isn't under your jurisdiction because they're Eastern Catholic. And sometimes Latin Rite bishops, power and politics and stuff like that, they're not too happy with the fact that there's some other churches that really aren't under their jurisdiction and their care. And so they haven't always been very cooperative. He says the church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies. Liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. It's likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, the sense of the primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, and the values so typical of Eastern spirituality. Constant intercession, penance, fasting, weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity. It is vital, then, that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake, perhaps, of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism. Now, okay, so he's telling them, hey, preserve your traditions, but it's not enough for Rome to just say that. Rome is going to have to actually back it up with legislation and make it possible for Eastern Catholics to really do that, especially in the diaspora. Rome's going to really have to back that up with actions instead of kind of saying that, but then putting obstacles. They're going to really need to back it up. We'll see if Leo continues, Pope Francis, who is starting to do that. Your traditions of spirituality, ancient yet ever new, are medicinal. In them, the drama of human misery is combined with wonder at God's mercy, so that our sinfulness does not lead to despair, but opens us to accepting the gracious gift of becoming creatures who are healed, divinized, and raised to the heights of heaven. For this, we ought to give endless praise and thanks to the Lord. Together we can pray with St. Ephraim the Syrian and say to the Lord Jesus, glory to you who laid your cross as a bridge over death, glory to you who clothed yourself in the body of mortal man and made it the source of life for all mortals. So here he's quoting Ephraim from that Syriac tradition. We must ask them for the grace to see the certainty of Easter in every trial of life and not to lose heart, remembering, as another great Eastern father wrote, the greatest sin is to not believe in the power of the resurrection. And here he's quoting Isaac of Nineveh. But the wild thing is, Isaac of Nineveh was never in communion with the Catholic Church. Isaac of Nineveh's church was in schism with the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches by rejecting the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council. And so this is interesting because you see a phenomenon of Rome, referring to people who lived their entire life in schism as saints. You even have one who is a doctor of the church, Gregory of Narek. He was never in communion. His church was never in communion. It rejected some of the ecumenical councils. But he's not only a saint in the Catholic Church, he's a doctor of the church. And so I think what you're going to see is some Eastern Catholics actually venerate, ironically, Isaac of Nineveh, and they try to make him a Chalcedonian with forgeries and stuff like that. But putting that to the side, other Eastern Orthodox are not happy at all with Isaac of Nineveh. He was a universalist. He maintained that everybody will be saved, Saint Isaac of Nineveh. So he held to some interesting views there. And again, his church was out of communion with the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics and rejected the Fourth Ecumenical Council. So some are going to look at this and say, "Oh, this is horrible. Why are you speaking of these people as canonized when they died outside of communion?" It kind of goes back to that show I did with y'all yesterday, Outside the Church There Is No Salvation, and how Rome has had to kind of interpret that in very, very different ways than maybe how perhaps the patristic period saw it in some ways. In many ways, it's been adapted and modified to the point that now Ratzinger and others, John Paul II, say that God can save people through the truth and false religions. And if that's salvific for them, obviously the claim would also be that, well, that applies to schismatics as well. So schismatics, heretics, people who are not in communion but are of the Christian tradition, they could also be saved. So that kind of explains why Rome has canonized some of these people. But it's interesting to see that because, I mean, you have Nestorius condemned at the Third Ecumenical Council and anathematized, but then he's venerated in some of these Eastern Catholic churches as a saint. So some of the people condemned at the ecumenical councils are saints in the Eastern Catholic tradition. So it's curious to see that he's kind of touching on that a little bit whenever he mentions and quotes approvingly Isaac of Nineveh, again, wasn't in communion, universalist. So that's going to raise some eyebrows, right? And some people love Isaac of Nineveh, right? Some Catholics love him, and so they're going to love this. Some have concerns and they might not be too happy about it, right? There are going to be different perspectives and different approaches. He says, "Who better than you can sing a song of hope even amid the abyss of violence? Who better than you who have experienced the horrors of war so closely that Pope Francis referred to you as martyr churches? From the Holy Land to Ukraine, from Lebanon to Syria, from the Middle East to Tigray and the Caucasus, how much violence do we see rising up from this horror, from the slaughter of so many young people, which ought to provoke outrage because lives are being sacrificed in the name of military conquest. There resounds an appeal, the appeal not so much of the Pope, but of Christ himself, who repeats, 'Peace be with you.' And he adds, 'Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I do not give it to you as the world gives it to you.' Christ's peace is not the sepulchral silence that reigns after the conflict. It is not the fruit of oppression, but rather a gift that is meant for all, a gift that brings new life. Let us pray for this peace, which is reconciliation, forgiveness, and the courage to turn the page and start anew. For my part, I'll make every effort so that this peace may prevail. The Holy See is always ready to help bring enemies together, face to face, talk to one another, so that peoples everywhere may once more find hope and recover the dignity they deserve, the dignity of the peace, of peace. The peoples of our world desire peace, and to their leaders I appeal with all my heart. Let us meet, let us talk, let us negotiate. War is never inevitable. Weapons can and must be silenced, for they do not resolve problems, but only increase them. Those who make history are the peacemakers, not those who sow seeds of suffering. Our neighbors are not first our enemies, but our fellow human beings, not criminals to be hated, but other men and women with whom we can speak. Let us reject the Manichaean notions so typical, that mindset of violence that divides the world into those who are good and those who are evil." So, I mean, he's clearly taking some sides here and positions here, and that's going to be controversial with some groups within East Orthodox. You're going to be very happy. Some in the Catholic Church will be happy with this. Others are going to be very concerned with what Pope Leo is saying. So, I mean, he is kind of taking a side here, right? The Church will never tire of repeating, "Let weapons be silenced." I would like to thank God for all those who in silence, prayer, and self-sacrifice are sowing seeds of peace. I thank God for those Christians, Eastern and Latin alike, who above all in the Middle East preserve and remain in their homelands, resisting the temptation to abandon them. Christians must be given the opportunity, and not just in words, to remain in their native lands with all the rights needed for a secure existence. Let us strive for this. Thank you, dear brothers and sisters of the East, the lands where Jesus, the Son of Justice, dawned, for being lights in our world. Continue to be outstanding for your faith, hope, and charity, and nothing else. May your churches be exemplary, and may your pastors promote communion with integrity, especially in the Synod of Bishops, that they may be places of fraternity and authentic co-responsibility. Because again, the Eastern churches govern synodally. They govern synodally. To one degree or another, Rome hasn't always allowed them to kind of, maintain the fullness of their synodal tradition and model here. There's some issues there. Maybe that will change under Leo XIV. Maybe some major archbishops will now be recognized as patriarchs. Hint, hint, right? Tabling that to the side, they govern synodally. They have that synodal model. They're really, really big on that. And he's saying, hey, continue that. Well, we'll see if Rome, backs it up, right? Ensure transparency in the administration of goods, and be signs of humble and complete dedication to the holy people of God without regard for honors, worldly power, or appearance. St. Simeon, the new theologian, used an eloquent image in this regard, just as one who throws dust on the flame of a burning furnace extinguishes it, so the cares of this life and every kind of attachment to petty and worthless things destroy the warmth of heart that was initially kindled. And here you got St. Simeon, the new theologian. So how many of y'all are familiar with him? So of course he lived in, I think he died in the 11th century, but Simeon, the new theologian, certainly an interesting figure that comes up in discussions between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox on the question of papal supremacy. So those of y'all who know, right? Today, more than ever, the splendor of the Christian East demands freedom from all worldly attachment and from every tendency contrary to communion, in order to remain faithful in obedience and in evangelical witness. I thank you for this, and in cordially giving you my blessing, I ask you to pray for the church and to raise your powerful prayers of your intercession for my ministry. Thank you. Okay, so there it is. I mean, short and sweet, right? And you have a few fathers, you have a few popes thrown in there. You have a few, not necessarily church fathers. I mean, all of these people are actually after the patristic period, but you have a few references there, from some figures in the first millennium. Isaac of Nineveh. Again, some people are going to love that. Others are going to hate it. Their hair is going to be on fire. Why in the world are you quoting? And so some people kind of struggle with some of these issues, and looks like that might continue into this pontificate if he's dropping names like Isaac of Nineveh. So, in fact, I interviewed one of the greatest scholars of the Syriac tradition. Interviewed him multiple times, Dr. Brock, and he and I did a show specifically on Isaac of Nineveh. So maybe go and watch that. I'll put it in the show notes. We talk about Isaac of Nineveh's universalism, his perspective on Chalcedon, and all of that. So maybe go and watch that if you haven't already. Fascinating stuff. Anyways, I wanted to sneak this in and kind of show y'all what he is saying here. I think overall this is going to be good news for everyone in the Eastern Catholic tradition. I think it will also be encouraging to some Eastern Orthodox. Other Eastern Orthodox are going to be very upset with this, not only in reference to some of the people he mentions, but also the position that he takes on some of the wars here. So it will be interesting to see how negotiations go with the Russian Orthodox Church after this, right? So we'll see how that one goes, the dialogue with them, right? Anyways, everybody hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Much more great content coming your way. Going to do another show later on today. But if you want to stay up to date with what's going on, Pope Leo's pontificate and everything else under the sun, you hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. All right, that's going to do it for now. We'll see you later. God bless.